General crisis. The general crisis of the 17th century was a prolonged series of economic, political, social, and climatic upheavals stretching from the late 16th to the early 18th century, with wide-ranging effects across Europe, China, the Ottoman Empire, Japan, and the Americas. Many historians have likened this period to a perfect storm in world history, when major civilizations simultaneously faced severe challenges. The term general crisis, introduced by historians Hugh Trevor Roper and Eric Hobsbawm, refers to this overlapping wave of crises. Large-scale wars, popular uprisings, dynastic collapses, economic depression, famine, and epidemic disease, all of which combined to disrupt the old order and pave the way for new forms of statehood, thought, and economic organization. One underlying factor was the global climatic phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age. Falling temperatures, harsher winters, shortened growing seasons, and extreme weather events led to widespread crop failures, famine, and disease, weakening social structures. Alongside this came economic turmoil. International trade slowed, silver prices collapsed, and economies heavily dependent on precious metals, such as Spain and China, fell into severe shortage. Many European governments defaulted on their debts, raised taxes to finance wars, and sparked unrest. Spain's silver-based system faltered. France's heavy taxation burdened the population, and Ming China's treasury collapsed as agriculture declined and tax revenues shrank. Economic strain fueled social conflict. Lower and middle classes revolted. Nobles resisted central authority, and confidence in ruling dynasties eroded. Religious divisions added fuel. Catholic-Protestant wars in Europe, Puritan-Anglican disputes in England, and anti-Christian resistance in Japan all contributed to prolonged instability. Key events illustrate the crisis. The 30 Years' War in Central Europe, 1618–1648, which killed millions. The English Civil War, 1642–1651, ending with the execution of Charles I. The Fronde uprisings in France, 1648–1653, revealing tension between monarchy and nobility. Spain's 1640 crisis, which sparked the Catalan Revolt and Portuguese independence. And in China, the fall of the Ming dynasty due to financial collapse and famine, paving the way for the Manchu conquest and the rise of the Qing dynasty in 1644. The Ottoman Empire faced inflation, revolts, and military stagnation, while its borderlands grew unstable. In the Americas, indigenous peoples suffered disease, dispossession, and forced labor. While colonial economies struggled with indirect effects of European wars, the demographic toll was severe. In many regions, populations fell by 30–50% due to war, famine, and disease. The Ming dynasty gave way to the Qing. Spain declined. France and Russia consolidated absolutist monarchies, and England moved toward constitutional rule. Traditional social hierarchies were shaken. Aristocratic and clerical power diminished, and some regions fell into near anarchy. Cities, monuments, and cultural treasures, from Magdeburg in Germany to late Ming Beijing, were destroyed. Yet the crisis also gave rise to renewal. Many states built stronger central governments, professional bureaucracies, standing armies, and more effective taxation systems. England gradually shifted toward constitutional monarchy, while France, Russia, and Prussia entrenched absolutism. Economically, England and the Netherlands advanced models of market exchange and free trade, laying foundations for the Industrial Revolution. In political thought, Thomas Hobbes, with Leviathan, defended absolute state power, while John Locke emphasized property rights and the rule of law ideas that shaped the Enlightenment and later revolutions. Culturally and scientifically, the 17th century was also the era of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, when science broke away from scholastic traditions to embrace experimentation. In the arts, the Baroque style, with its drama and contrasts, reflected both chaos and the desire for order. Humanity began to recognize that crisis was an integral part of history, both destructive and generative. Thus, the general crisis of the 17th century was not merely a time of global suffering, but a pivotal transitional period in which societies learned to adapt, build modern states, and develop political and scientific thought that carried them into a new age. British credit. The credit crisis of 1772 to 1773 in Britain was one of the largest financial shocks of 18th-century Europe, especially notable because it occurred during peacetime. The crisis began in June 1772, when Alexander Fordyce, a Scottish banker in London, lost about £300,000 from short-selling shares of the East India Company and fled to France to escape creditors. His collapse triggered a chain reaction. Within 2 weeks, at least 8 London banks and around 20 more across Europe declared bankruptcy. Contemporary newspapers were filled with stories of merchants ruined and resorting to desperate ends, reflecting the widespread panic gripping the financial world. After Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War in 1763, the empire expanded its territories and global trade. Between 1763 and 1772, the economy boomed on the back of commerce and easy credit. Banks in London and Glasgow aggressively extended loans to the North American and Caribbean colonies. Bills of exchange became a common medium of deferred payment, but the system rested on fragile credit foundations. In Scotland, private banks grew rapidly, but with little oversight. The Ayr Bank, notorious for issuing rolling bills and reckless lending, became a financial bubble waiting to burst. Meanwhile, Fordyce made massive speculative bets that East India Company shares would fall. When his gamble failed, his enormous debts dragged down linked banks, shaking the entire credit system. News of Fordyce's default sparked a run on London banks. Within a week, more than 8 institutions shut their doors, and the credit market froze. In Scotland, the Ayr Bank collapsed, along with many others, leaving over 100 shareholders personally ruined under unlimited liability. On the continent, Amsterdam, the financial hub of Europe, was also rattled as investors pulled capital en masse, causing a brief but sharp disruption. The East India Company, already burdened with vast unsold inventories, suddenly found itself unable to raise loans and had to be rescued by the British government. As part of this bailout, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773 to help the company sell its surplus tea in the American colonies, a measure that inflamed colonial resistance and directly contributed to the Boston Tea Party. The crisis left dozens of British and Scottish banks bankrupt, merchants insolvent, and credit severely tightened in the American colonies. Plantation owners in Virginia and Maryland were suddenly pressed to settle debts in cash rather than bills of exchange, fueling resentment among the colonial middle class. Public confidence in private bankers collapsed. Many were mocked, shunned, or driven to ruin. The Tea Act of 1773, an indirect consequence of the crisis, was perceived by Americans as a symbol of unjust privilege and became a catalyst for the revolutionary movement. The failure of the Ayr Bank provided a bitter lesson for Scottish finance, paving the way for a more cautious and sustainable banking model. For the first time, the Bank of England was compelled to act as a lender of last resort, laying foundations for the modern concept of macroeconomic management. Meanwhile, Adam Smith, then writing The Wealth of Nations, adjusted his arguments to emphasize credit, transparency, and the importance of financial regulation ideas that would shape classical economics. Alexander Fordyce became a symbol of greed and reckless speculation. Caricatures, pamphlets, and moralizing commentaries abounded, calling for a return to thrift and honesty. The crisis left not only economic and political consequences, but also advanced the development of modern economic thought. Thinkers like Adam Smith, David Hume, and other scholars engaged in deeper debates about credit cycles, curbing speculation, and the role of central banks. These debates continue to influence financial and banking theory well into the 21st century. Long Depression. The Long Depression, 1873–1896, was one of the first global economic crises of the industrial era. It began on the 9th of May, 1873, when the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed after years of overheated growth. Just months later, on September 18, the American bank J. Cook & Co., a principal financier of the Northern Pacific Railroad, declared bankruptcy. This triggered a financial panic in New York that quickly spread to Europe, pulling both sides of the Atlantic into a prolonged downturn. The background to the crisis was one of excessive optimism. After the Franco-Prussian War, a massive flow of French indemnity payments into Germany fueled a wave of investment and speculation. In the United States, the post-Civil War years saw a boom in railroads and industry, financed by abundant credit and bond issuance. In the 1870s, many European countries abandoned the silver standard in favor of the gold standard, including Germany and the US. This contraction of the money supply reduced demand, raised interest rates, and put deflationary pressure on the economy. When the bubbles in railroads and industry burst, banks and companies could not meet their obligations, and the crisis broke wide open. In the US, the downturn lasted more than 5 years. Some 18,000 businesses, including dozens of railroads, went bankrupt. Millions lost their jobs, wages fell, and prices continued to decline. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the first nationwide strike in U.S. history, highlighted the depth of social discontent. In Britain, the economy did not collapse suddenly, but slipped into long stagnation. Grain and industrial goods prices fell sharply under competition from the U.S. and Russia, while German and American industries surged ahead. In Germany, after the Gründerkrach crash of 1873, Chancellor Bismarck responded with protectionist tariffs and pioneering social welfare measures. France faced its own shock in 1882 when the failure of Union Generale Bank led to the collapse of the Paris stock market. Across southern and eastern Europe, peasants and workers endured deep hardship, fueling mass migration to the Americas. The Long Depression drove down prices and industrial profits for decades. Banking systems were badly damaged, credit contracted, and new investment dried up. Unemployment soared in industrial nations, inequality widened, and waves of strikes and labor unrest broke out. Falling prices for agricultural and raw materials pushed many farmers and small landowners into bankruptcy. Free trade gave way to protectionism, seen in France's Méline tariff and Germany's customs policies. The crisis had far-reaching effects beyond economics. It energized the international labor movement and the rise of social democratic parties in Europe. In the U.S., it fueled populist agitation for monetary reform and corporate regulation. At the same time, the downturn allowed powerful corporations like Carnegie Steel and Standard Oil to consolidate their dominance, pushing the economy toward trusts and monopolies. Fierce debates over the gold versus silver standard erupted in late 19th century America. Culturally and socially, the Depression encouraged new social reform movements, such as the social gospel in the U.S., the settlement house movement in Britain, and charitable initiatives across Europe, laying groundwork for the 20th century welfare state. In science, the Long Depression became a testing ground for the birth of modern macroeconomics, theories of business cycles, and monetary policy. It forced academics and policymakers to reconsider the role of the state in managing the economy, leaving a lasting imprint on the economic doctrines and policies of the 20th and 21st CE. Great Depression. The Great Depression was the most severe economic crisis in modern history. It began in the United States in 1929 when the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday, October 29. Within a few years, the shockwaves spread worldwide. Tens of millions lost their jobs, thousands of banks failed, international trade collapsed, and humanity entered a deep economic darkness. The disaster originated with a speculative stock bubble in the U.S. Millions of investors borrowed heavily to buy shares, artificially driving up prices. When the market collapsed, panic set in, and people rushed to withdraw savings en masse. With no deposit insurance, banks across the country failed in waves. Policy missteps made matters worse. Adherence to the gold standard contracted the money supply, while the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act sharply raised import duties, crippling international trade. In a tightly interconnected global financial and trading system, America's downturn quickly escalated into a worldwide crisis. In the U.S., GDP fell by nearly 30%, industrial output by almost half, and unemployment soared to 25%. Millions lost their homes and were forced to live in shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. Long breadlines of unemployed workers waiting for food aid became iconic images of the era. In Europe, Germany was hit especially hard due to its reliance on American loans. Unemployment reached nearly 30%, paving the way for Hitler's rise to power. Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and many other nations sank into depression, while Latin America faced collapsing commodity prices, financial turmoil, and worsening political instability. The immediate effects were catastrophic. World trade shrank by more than 50%, and millions fell into poverty and homelessness. Society was paralyzed, and confidence in free markets collapsed. In Germany and Italy, economic desperation fueled the rise of fascism. Elsewhere, governments were forced to intervene in economies on an unprecedented scale, breaking with the laissez-faire model that had previously dominated. In the U.S., President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a program built around three goals: relief, recovery, and reform. The government created massive public works projects to generate jobs, tightened regulation of banks and the stock market, and established the beginnings of a social safety net. Many other countries abandoned the gold standard, lowered interest rates, and expanded public spending to stimulate demand. Yet, it was not until World War II, with its surge in defense production, that economies fully emerged from depression. The Great Depression left enduring legacies. It marked the rise of Keynesian economics, laying the foundation for active government intervention to manage economic cycles. It set the stage for the modern welfare state. Politically, the crisis directly contributed to World War II and reshaped the global order. After the war, determined to avoid a repeat of 1929, nations built the Bretton Woods system, created the IMF and World Bank, and expanded social welfare policies, all deeply influenced by the bitter lessons of the Great Depression. Oil shock. The two oil shocks of the 1970s were turning points in global energy and economic history. In 1973, when the United States supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Arab oil-exporting nations of OAPEC retaliated by cutting production and imposing an embargo on the U.S. and its allies. Within months, oil prices nearly quadrupled, from $3 to $12 per barrel. A fuel crisis erupted across the U.S., Japan, and Western Europe. Images of long lines of cars at gas stations and fuel ration coupons became symbols of the era. Just 6 years later, the world was hit again. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution toppled the pro-Western monarchy, sharply reducing the country's oil output. Soon after, the Iran-Iraq War brought further disruption to regional supply. Oil prices soared from around $15 to nearly $40 per barrel in just 1 year. While the actual decline in production was not massive, panic and speculation magnified the crisis. The consequences of these twin shocks were severe. They triggered stagflation, high inflation combined with recession across most industrialized economies. The US, Western Europe, and Japan all faced negative growth, high unemployment, and stalled production. While inflation surged into double digits, oil-importing developing countries plunged into balance of payments, crises, and heavy debt. Even oil exporters, though enriched by windfall revenues, faced the long-term risk of overdependence on oil income. Politically, the shocks destabilized the Western alliance, fueled extremism and conflict in the Middle East, and prompted the U.S. to expand its military presence in the region. Policy responses quickly followed. The U.S. created the Department of Energy, introduced fuel efficiency standards, and built the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The International Energy Agency, IEA, was founded to coordinate policies among oil-consuming nations. Japan and Europe invested heavily in nuclear power, developed oil production in the North Sea and Alaska, and promoted energy conservation. Oil exporters, meanwhile, realized that excessively high prices would encourage alternatives and erode their market share in the long run. The oil shocks did more than shake the world economy, they reshaped thinking about energy security. Industrial nations gradually reduced dependence on Middle Eastern oil, diversified supply sources, and improved energy efficiency. In economics, controlling inflation became the central priority of macroeconomic policy. Geopolitically, the oil weapon demonstrated its power, but also revealed its self-defeating consequences. More than half a century later, the memory of the 1970s oil shocks endures as a stark reminder that energy is inseparable from global security and stability. Latin American. In August 1982, Mexico made an announcement that sent shockwaves across the global financial system. It could no longer meet its foreign debt obligations on time. This declaration marked the beginning of one of the most severe financial crises in Latin American history. Within a year, major economies such as Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, and others found themselves in similar situations, facing partial or full defaults, or scrambling to restructure their external debts. This wave of financial stress triggered what experts later dubbed La Década Perdida, or the Lost Decade. It was a period of economic stagnation, political shifts, and long-lasting social impacts across the region. But the crisis didn't happen overnight. Throughout the 1970s, especially after the oil shock of 1973, Latin American countries took advantage of cheap credit offered by Western banks, which had surplus liquidity from oil-exporting nations. Eager to fund ambitious development plans, these governments borrowed rapidly to support industrialization, infrastructure, and social welfare. However, under regimes that were often authoritarian or semi-democratic, resource allocation was uneven, and inefficiencies, even corruption, diluted the effectiveness of many investments. By 1982, the region's external debt had surged to over $327 billion, more than 10 times what it had been at the start of the decade. The turning point came from outside the region. In the late 1970s, to curb high inflation in the U.S., Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker implemented a dramatic hike in interest rates, pushing global rates close to 20%. This sudden spike in borrowing costs hit developing countries hard. At the same time, global demand weakened, and commodity prices, oil, metals, and agricultural products dropped sharply. With reduced export revenues and rapidly depreciating local currencies, many countries struggled to service their dollar-denominated debts. Mexico was simply the first to reveal what had been building up for years. What began as a single-country problem soon evolved into a systemic regional crisis. More than 16 countries had to renegotiate their debt. Western commercial banks, including major U.S. institutions like Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America, faced significant risk exposure. This prompted coordinated action by the U.S. government, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to arrange emergency lending packages. In exchange, recipient countries were required to implement strict reforms, cutting public spending, removing subsidies, privatizing state-owned enterprises, opening markets, devaluing local currencies, and reducing state control over the economy. These structural adjustment programs laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Washington Consensus, a market-oriented policy framework that influenced development thinking for decades. While these emergency loans helped countries meet short-term payments and avoided a global financial meltdown, they didn't fully address the root causes of the crisis. By the mid-1980s, the Baker Plan was introduced to inject new capital and support growth, but with limited results. In 1987, Brazil, one of the largest economies in the region, suspended debt payments altogether. A more meaningful turning point came in 1989 with the Brady Plan, which allowed debt to be converted into Brady bonds and included partial debt forgiveness, creating a path toward stabilization and renewed growth in the early 1990s. During the crisis years, most of Latin America saw little to no GDP growth. In countries like Argentina and Brazil, inflation soared into the thousands of percent. Public and private investment collapsed. Unemployment rose. Local currencies weakened. Access to essential goods became limited. Austerity measures, often linked to IMF guidance, disproportionately affected low- and middle-income households. Meanwhile, financial elites found ways to move assets abroad. Social unrest erupted across the region, from Mexico to Bolivia. Migration surged toward the US and Europe, and rising crime added to the challenges. But the shockwaves weren't just economic. The crisis also weakened the legitimacy of authoritarian military regimes that had long ruled many Latin American countries. Within a decade, democratic transitions took hold: Argentina in 1983, Brazil in 1985, and Chile later in the decade. People hoped that democratic governance would bring more transparency and accountability to economic policy. However, the new governments still faced the same challenges: budget deficits, weak banking systems, and economies heavily reliant on external debt. Over time, Latin America began to shift its development model. The state-centered import substitution approach gave way to market liberalization, private investment, and global integration. Inflation was eventually brought under control, and growth returned in the 1990s. But inequality persisted, and many of the poorest segments of society saw limited benefits from the reforms. For global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, the crisis led to a rethink. Newer programs such as HIP-C and PRGF were designed with more flexibility and focus on human development, not just fiscal balance. The crisis also expanded the US's political and financial influence in the region, largely through its leadership within international institutions. But at the same time, a growing backlash against liberalization took root, paving the way for the rise of left-leaning governments in the early 21st century. These new leaders promoted development models that emphasized social equity and national autonomy. More than 4 decades later, La Década Perdida remains a powerful reference in journalism, film, literature, and collective memory. Scenes of food lines, urban protests, and mass migration are still symbols of a time few wish to relive. For economists, the crisis helped define modern concepts like debt overhang, moral hazard, and sovereign debt restructuring, ideas now central to fiscal policy in the developing world. But beyond technical lessons, the deeper questions remain as relevant as ever. How do we grow without over-relying on debt? How do we build fair economies that don't leave the vulnerable behind? And in the end, who bears the cost when the numbers no longer add up?